10. On the Silk Roads. Sparrowhawk Castle, the Caravanserai, Tabriz, the Old Man of the Mountain, Gog and Magog. As a slave and soldier and prisoner and pilgrim and mercenary, Johann Schildberger had visited much of the Middle East, travelling through parched deserts and minareted cities. Yet he never managed to see a place he had heard so much about, Sparrowhawk Castle. Schildberger was born in a small Bavarian town in 1380. Aged 16, he left his high-born family to fight in the retinue of the nobleman Leinhard Rekatingen against the Ottoman Turks. They soon became involved in a violent confrontation in which Rekatingen was killed and Schildberger wounded and taken prisoner. For 31 years, he served, sometimes as prisoner, sometimes as household retainer, first in armies of the Ottoman Sultan and then under the Timurid Sultans. Timur 1336 to 1405, Shah Rukh 1377 to 1447, and Miran Shah 1366 to 1408. Their empire covered much of Central Asia from Aleppo in the west to Herat, Samarkand and Tashkent in the east. Schildberger later served as a Tatar prince named Shekra around Armenia and Siberia. He finally escaped in the Georgian port of Batumi, sailing across the Black Sea to Constantinople, and made his way home to Bavaria in 1427, where he wrote an account of his travels and the many strange things he had seen and what he called his interesting and strange adventures. Schildberger was a practical, adaptable and curious young man, and took the opportunity of his itinerant captivity to see the world. He started to notice marvels and miracles wherever he was taken. At the siege of the port city of Samsun on the northern coast of Turkey, he saw countless snakes and vipers descend on the city, some from the sea and some from the forests. They had no interest in harming people or even cattle, but the serpents went to war against each other for 11 days. On the 11th day, the sea serpents were vanquished by the forest snakes. The lifeless bodies of 8,000 vipers were gathered up and buried. This was taken as a divine portent that the Sultan would also soon have mastery of the seas as he had mastery of the land. Schildberger wrote that he saw 9,000 virgins taken into captivity in a dusty battle in Cilicia. He saw trained tusked elephants go to war in Tartary, their trunks ferrying cannons between the troops. He saw entire towns levelled with their inhabitants still alive as their houses were razed around them. In the desert, he met villagers who had an infinite quantity of spices but no cattle and little water. He saw kings trade entire territories for jewels and gold. He met a widowed Tartar princess who kept a retinue of 4,000 women, all of whom could ride war horses and shoot a bow and arrow as well as any man. At Isfahan, with its elegant bridges, arches and shaded precincts, Schildberger witnessed the thumbs of 12,000 archers cut off and a tower made from the skulls of thousands of murdered children of the vanquished residents. The Castilian ambassador, Clavijo, saw a similar tower made of Tatar skulls at Damgan, east of Tehran. Even though he had seen such things no other Bavarian ever saw, Schildberger longed to see Sparrowhawk Castle. People said it was a short distance from the city of Trabzon, or perhaps somewhere else on the coast in the territories of the lords of Koracus, or perhaps deeper in Armenia and its many realms that only unwillingly gave up their secrets to the traveller. Everyone knew the story of Sparrowhawk Castle. Schildberger had even read about it as a young man and had heard tell of it throughout his travels. So he paid a guide to take him there. And the guide had led him along hidden tracks through thick forests and across strangely shaped hillocks baked by the sun. Eventually, they reached a mountain topped by Sparrowhawk Castle, or at least what the guide told him was Sparrowhawk Castle. At Sparrowhawk Castle there was said to dwell a princess, the most beautiful woman in the world. Men described her as part deity, part seductress. She was as slender as a stoat, and had the most delicate arched brows and a mouth as sweet as mead. People told how inside this palace the princess lived alone, with just a sparrowhawk for company. The sparrowhawk sat with its yellow claws wrapped around a walnut wood perch decorated with onyx. Its bright, watchful eyes seemed ever open, unblinking, sleepless. The hawk vibrated silently with knowledge and wisdom. Once a day, it swooped from its perch and diligently hunted vermin and insects and wild prey, thereby cleansing his mistress's castle. The princess, despite her seductive demeanour and immodest apparel, was said to be a virgin and a devout Christian. She was retaining her virginity until a brave knight could come along and keep watch for 3 days and 3 nights without sleeping. If they could do this, they could ask the princess for whatever they wanted, as long as it was pure. One prince of Armenia had managed the sleepless watch. After 3 days and nights, his body swayed, his bladder was near to bursting, and his knees were shaky as a milk pudding. The princess congratulated him on his achievement and asked what pure thing he wanted. The Armenian prince said that the pure thing he wanted was to take her as his wife. But as he said this, he felt a powerful lust for the princess's body and became aware of his private parts stirring for her. The princess immediately understood the impure motives behind the prince's request. She banished him, screamed insults and shaming reproaches at him, and cursed his entire kin too. So the chatelaine of Sparrowhawk Castle remained pure and chaste, exposing the dirty thoughts of the men who came there. Like her faithful Sparrowhawk, she cleansed the world by revealing the inner corruption of those who crawl across its surface. Schildberger gazed up at the walls of the castle he had been led to, with its slab-like stone gate and fearsome portcullis. In the distance, he may have caught a glimpse of the prettiest chateau, all delicate spires with rose-tinted slate roofs and dozens of neat chimneys and golden finials and copper weather vanes, filigree mullioned windows, ogis and lancets and soaring arched colonnades. But maybe that was a mirage. The gates were locked and nobody seemed to be there. No princess, no Sparrowhawk. A wasted journey. The local priest said the whole thing was the devil's work, not God's, so they turned back. The guide who had taken Schildberger's money, promising to show him the castle, soon vanished. Regretfully, we've wandered off our route, travelling northwest from Jerusalem, when we should be travelling eastwards. We've been distracted with stories of sparrowhawks, damsels, and priapic knights. This is precisely what everyone says happens to the traveller. If they are not vigilant, travellers get sidetracked, led astray, and find themselves lost. And to be a lost traveller is almost as bad as being a bored one. So, as Sparrowhawk Castle is not on the route to anywhere, we can put it aside and go nowhere with Schildberger, instead to continue onwards with our proper journey to join the Silk Roads. What we now call the Silk Road, largely a 20th century term, is not one road, but rather a collective noun for the east-west routes by land and sea across Eurasia, from Egypt to China, from Turkey to India. Not only silk, but much more was traded along these routes. Spices for medicine and cookery, jewels, beverages, animals. There are copious records of the silk route trade in furs and hides, precious stones, dyes, suet, soap, oils, wine, sulphur, rice, alum, sugar, pottery, amber, mercury, caviar, henna. Goods on the Silk Roads travelled both east-west and west-east. English and Scottish wool, French drapery, Italian glass and steelwork, for example, were traded eastwards. The Silk Roads were also the vehicle for human exchange via missionizing, slavery, sex work, and hospitality. Around 1300, the Silk Road stretched across an enormous area and had become a well-organized network reaching across Europe and Asia, with guidebooks for merchants in Italian and Catalan. An exemplar of these is Francesco Balducci Pagolotti's Pratica della Mercatura, the practice of commerce, circa 1340. Pagolotti was a Florentine merchant, and his handbook was designed to enable Europeans, especially Europeans from growing mercantile cities like Florence, to practice business in the East. The Pratica was a direct forerunner of a modern business travel manual, focused on international market agility rather than curiosity or religion. The chronology of Pagolotti's life is hard to reconstruct with precision, but he spent much of his life connected to the Great Bardi banking and trading company of Florence. He went to Antwerp in the early 14th century to secure privileges for the Florentines there, and then spent some years in London, where he became director of the English office of the Bardi and transacted business with the papacy and with the English monarchy. He sailed from London in 1321 to the then English port of Libourne in Gascony and via Tuscany, spent about 5 years in Cyprus as the Bardi representative in Famagusta. He intermittently returned to Florence, where he had periods of success in Florentine local government, but also seems to have spent time in Armenia, probably dwelling in Ayas, now Yurmatalik, again representing Florentine business interests. The Silk Roads were configured around mercantilism, and this is reflected in the Pratica della Mercatura. Pegalotti was partly concerned with safety and local cultures, but most of his guidebook is about weights and measures, currency conversion and mints, transit duties and tolls and lodgings, the emerging practicalities of business travel. Via the Silk Roads, we can see the emergence of the businessman and business traveller. A person who travels motivated not by religion or wanderlust, but by profit. Yet the Silk Roads were also the stage for pluralistic encounters, the exchange of ideas and engagements with curious novelties. There, travellers came into contact with other people and with situations that challenged their ethical bearing and required new ways of engaging with the wider world. Pegalotti's guide is, among other things, a fascinating glossary of the key language the traveller needed on a journey across the diverse and fluid worlds of the Silk Roads. For instance, he gave word lists in a wide range of languages, from Flemish to Armenian, for terms like customs and marketplace, and translated values of coinage. He gave instructions on how to refine gold found in the wild and very detailed advice on how to avoid being duped by foreign merchants when buying spices and other goods. It is unlikely that Pegalotti went all the way to China, although his book gestures to the routes across Asia. What is almost entirely missing from his book is a sense of him travelling through interesting or distracting places. He was a diligent and committed merchant, and the Silk Roads for him and his merchant readers were a stage for transactions and profits, not curiosity. The vast spectrum of commodities he traded included Persian rosewater, Socotra aloes, Bulgarian vair, Sumatran camphor, Tartary shot silks, Egyptian linen, ginger from Arabia and India, Asian rhubarb, and Indian spikenard. His sense of place was that of the marketplace. Pegalotti's book discloses an anxiety about fraud and dishonesty in foreign markets, but it also presupposes a great deal of trust, especially in assumptions about safety when travelling. He largely assumed that Italian merchants had the right to trade and travel through the Near East, and his concern was with providing full details of what taxes should and should not be paid. At Tanna, a crucial Venetian entrepot between the Black Sea and the Volga, he gave a clear account of what duties were due. For instance, gold, silver, and pearls attracted no duties. Neither the Mongol Tamunga Tamha tax, which was charged on the movement of goods and people, nor the commercio levy, a customs or sales tax. Wine, ox hides, saddles, and horse hides attracted a 5% duty, except for Genoese and Venetians who paid 4%. The charging of customs was a way of protecting trades and manipulating prices, but it was also a way of attracting revenue, which could then be spent on improving facilities for traders. Pegalotti is clear that pacts, special bargains, could be made with the doganieri, customs officers, and there was usually room to negotiate. Health and safety. If you think you have leprosy, or if you know a leper, you need to know about the wonderful well of Urfa. Its waters heal lepers, as long as they follow this prescription. They must fast for 5 days, and on each day they must drink the well's water and wash themselves in it. After 5 days, they should stop washing with it, but still drink it up to the 10th or 12th day. Like travellers in Europe, those travelling on the Silk Roads were often required to prove their credentials. Italian merchants carried letters of introduction, letters of exchange, and safe conducts, and they relied on written contracts. Pegalotti had a letter of safe conduct from the King of England when he left the British Isles in 1321. He even gave illustrated information about the merchants' marks stamped in loaves of sugar to protect property and quality. Pegalotti included information on all the crucial middlemen of Silk Road travel, the calamancio, interpreter, alzatori, hoisters who loaded and unloaded freight, bastagori, porters, curatiere and sensali, brokers, scarsiglieri, couriers, scrivani, clerks and scriveners, vetturali, carters, and tantauli, guards. By the second quarter of the 14th century, business travel was supported by industries that enabled, protected, and profited from the people and spaces of the Silk Roads. Similarly, from the early 13th century, Mongol officials, couriers, and merchants carried a metal passport, a paitsa, a stamped seal of authority given by the imperial preceptor of the Mongol court. The paitsa represented an edict of the Mongol supreme leader, the great Khagan or Khan, that the bearer should be allowed to travel freely with unsparing inscriptions such as, "He who has no respect shall be guilty," or, "I am the great Khan's emissary. If you defy me, you die." Marco Polo's will refer to such tablets presented to him by Kublai Khan, reigned 1260 to 94, to ensure his free movement across the Silk Roads. Polo kept them until his death, apparently as precious material trophies of the privilege to travel freely. The main punctuation of a traveller's journey on the Silk Roads was provided by the institution of the caravanserai, sometimes called by its Turkish name, Han. A caravanserai was similar to the Hansa Kontor, Venetian Fondaco, and Jerusalemite Muristan we visited earlier. It was foremost a place for the lodging of a caravan. Caravanserai is from the Persian term for a sarai, palace, enclosure for a caravan. A group of travellers which could comprise merchants, pilgrims, scholars, servants, slaves, vagrants, and animals. Some caravanserais were monumental, elegant, built to last, although conditions within them were not necessarily luxurious. Each caravanserai, usually placed a day's travel apart on the main routes, held huge amounts of merchandise and supplies. The 12th century historian Geoffrey of Winsouth described the contents as including everything from spices and silks and costly cushions to armour, medicines, chess sets and barley. A caravanserai was usually fortified or defensive, built with thick walls, few or no windows, and just a single entrance tall enough to allow laden animals, exhausted camels, asses, and horses to enter. Once inside, there was a courtyard or central hall, a kind of hub in which people socialized and ate. The animals slept and rested, and little stalls were set up to sell things among the travelers. Not just spices and silks, but also travelers' essentials like horseshoes, new clothes and footwear, vessels for drinks. They sold food for the onward journey too, melons, cheese, all sorts of fruit. There was likely also a well where everyone could get some fresh water if they dared. And there were messengers and couriers and sex workers for hire. Some caravanserais had small individual rooms along arcaded aisles, perhaps on a second floor, but it was common for travellers to sleep on the floor, as at the Muristan in Jerusalem, on hastily assembled pallets and mattresses in cell-like side booths. Pegalotti listed each caravanserai, or gavassera as he called it, at which custom fees were charged, and the caravanserai can be seen as the forerunner at once of local government offices, postal networks, and roadside rest areas. The caravanserai also in some ways anticipated an international hotel chain in which the guests could be comforted by the predictable nature of their lodging. But far from being like a luxury palace or international mall, a medieval caravanserai was often more like an ornate barn. In its aisles and precinct spaces were reserved for the animals' owners and their human servants, where people could bed down on a mattress not far from the braying asses and ripe dung. Indeed, the pack animals may well have been considered more important than many of the human guests, as the animals were the main means of transport and also represented a significant investment. At Aruk in Armenia, the beautiful caravanserai was built around a central hall for housing the animals, with troughs working into the masonry for their hay and water. The creatures that enabled the journeys were therefore at the centre of the caravanserai. In the better caravanserais, humans might find lodging in the upstairs arcades. In the various abutments and side rooms, there were sometimes latrines, baths, mosques, and chapels, perhaps a slaughterhouse or a laundry, quarters for a physician, a vet, a bath attendant, an imam, a porter, or even a small garrison. Storerooms full of honey, oil, candles, mead, grain, sometimes a separate section for female guests. Each caravanserai had cats to deter mice from infesting the grain stores. Remains of caravanserais can be found all along the Silk Roads from Cyprus to China, but especially in today's Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Iraq, Iran, and Uzbekistan. It was common for a caravanserai to be founded by a local prince or bishop, an act of commercial magnificence and social welfare, all the better to attract people and their trade to the area and connect their territory to places far beyond. At the Orbelian caravanserai, built in 1332, high in the Armenian Vardanyat Pass, a winged beast and a carved bull decorated the tougher doorway, alongside the devout inscriptions mixing Armenian, Persian, and Turkish, imploring those who pass by to remember the charity of those who built it. Supporting travel could fulfill the biblical injunction to give food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty, and to welcome the stranger, Matthew chapter 25, verse 35. Or, as St. Paul warned, never forget hospitality towards guests, because some, not aware of it, have entertained angels. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. One never knew who might be in the next caravan. Pegalotti described numerous caravanserais on the route between Ayas, Yumurtalik, and Tabriz, and his itinerary included a stay at which he called the Gavasera del Soldano, the Sultan's caravanserai. This was the lavish Tuzisir Sultanhan, on an ancient route from Kayseri to Sivas. It was one of several founded, as its name suggests, by the Seljuk Sultan, Kayukabad I, died 1237. The exterior was decorated with carved geometric patterns and meandering interwoven stars. Expressive lions' heads frowned from the waterspouts. An impressive crown door suggested that one was passing into the Sultan's care and comfort. Elaborate vaulting welcomed the visitor into a canopy of heavenly order. Upon entry, there were dozens of rooms and fountains too. Then, stepping through the opening section, the visitor entered a large courtyard, partly covered, decorated with dragons writhing in stone ribbons around the elaborate arches. There was an elevated kiosk mosque, a little adorned hall standing on arches opposite the entrance. Vaulted eastern and western wings were used for storage and loading, and there was an extremely well-appointed bathhouse with hot and cold areas. Everything in the caravanserai was configured for travel and mobility. It would usually have been able to house between 50 and 200 guests. In its transience, it was emphatically not a destination, but a staging post to elsewhere. Like so many institutions for travellers, the caravanserai was an unpredictable space of social mixing, combining local customs with people from across Europe and Asia. It was not expensive. Indeed, if one didn't have the money, one could often stay for free for up to 3 days, and so the kind of people one encountered there was eclectic, even random. The merchant diplomats, Josephat Barbaro and Ambrogio Contarini, described in detail what it was like to travel on the late medieval Silk Roads. Both Barbaro and Contarini were Venetian ambassadors to Uzun Hasan. Shah Uzun Hasan died 1478, ruler of the Ak-Koyunlu state, which covered most of what is today Iran and Iraq. Barbaro made various journeys across Persia and the Caucasus, first as a merchant from 1436 until about 1452, and later in life as the Venetian ambassador to Persia from 1472 until 1479. Contarini travelled through Persia and Turkey in 1474-7. As ambassadors, their task was ultimately to ally the Venetian state with the Persians against the Turks. Each left detailed accounts of their journeys. Their writings reveal the well-developed infrastructure for travel across the Silk Roads, but show how progress could be slow, arduous, and perilous. Barbaro described how he and his group travelled from the Black Sea port of Tana using a kind of sled, Zena from the Russian Sani, with which to navigate the frozen rivers. It was novel to him that the Tatars preferred to travel in winter, when the ground was frozen, rather than in summer, when they were beset by biting insects. Barbaro's journey with the Tatars included herds of camel and oxen and massive numbers of horses. He says that one caravan he encountered in Persia included 4,000 horses. In his account, the Silk Roads were busy. Every route was full of people and beasts following on their way. Each traveller, he said, brought a 2-wheel cart with them, enclosed with reed matting. Wealthier travellers had felt or cloth coverings. On some of these carts, travellers carried a timber-hooped little house, a yurt, covered with reeds, felt, or cloth, so that when they lodge, they take down these houses to lodge in. Women in the caravan wore horsehair face masks to defend them from the burning sun in clear weather. Some carried babes in arms, the left hand both cradling the baby and holding the horse's bridle, the right hand driving the horse, beating him with a whip bound to their little finger. Barbaro described scouts on the route, travelling anywhere between 4 and 20 days ahead of the caravan. They carried goatskin bottles full of dry meal, to which they would add a little water to make a sustaining paste, supplemented by shooting game on the route, or, failing that, eating whatever herbs and roots could be found. Barbaro stayed at caravanserais and fundachi, in lodging houses and in portable yurts when he travelled with a Tatar caravan. At Yazd, he visited the fundako, where the merchants lodged and sold their silks and other wares in little shops, each about 6 foot square. Particularly noteworthy for him were the paper price tags on the merchandise, as paper in Europe was still largely used for luxuries like books. During his journey, at the hilltop town of Mardin, famous for its silks and fustians, Barbaro stayed in a traveller's hostel founded by the local lord's brother. People here were given food, and if they seem persons of any estimation, they have carpets laid under their feet. Barbaro was amazed at this profligacy, as the carpets alone seemed to be worth more than the very large sum of 100 ducats apiece. Sitting alone in the hostel one day, he was suddenly confronted by a naked man. From his goatskin satchel, the man, a local sage, produced a little book and began to read prayers. He inched nearer to Barbaro and asked, "What are you?" Barbaro replied, "I am a stranger." To this the man replied, "I also am a stranger to this world, and so are we all, and so I have left it in order to behave in this manner until my end." He told Barbaro to despise the world, comforting him with good and eloquent words. Barbaro called the mystical conversation a strange event and recorded it as a memorable encounter. In the caravanserai and other Silk Road lodgings, such cryptic encounters could take place as diverse worlds were brought together in a transient but intimate community. At Antalya, Barbaro stayed at a caravanserai which functioned as a customs house. This was not unusual. Here he tried to keep himself aloof, waiting for the caravan to depart, but he was approached by a man who demanded 5 ducats from him as a customs duty because he believed Barbaro was going all the way to Jerusalem. Barbaro sought to explain that he was not going to Jerusalem, and a fight broke out between the man who demanded the payment and another man who had vouched for Barbaro. Curses and punches were thrown, and the man who had demanded the payment from Barbaro shouted at him, "You fool, you'll forever be a fool," as Barbaro took his horse and fled the caravanserai. He went onwards to Beirut, thence to Cyprus and homewards to Venice. The whole unhappy encounter has the air of an unfortunate set of misunderstandings, where confusions over language and culture escalate rapidly, and the traveller suddenly longs to be anywhere else than where they've found themselves. Like Barbaro, Contarini stayed in conventional lodgings like caravanserais, but Contarini, a less hardy and less contented traveller than Barbaro, also described the wide variety of accommodation he had to endure. Somewhere near Zhytomyr, he could find no lodging and was forced to sleep in a dangerous forest infested with discontented men and with no food to eat. In Georgia, he likewise frequently had to sleep in the woods. At a lodging house in Astrakhan, all Contarini's jewels and merchandise were confiscated and a great sum of money extorted from him. At Qom, he was forced to spend 2 nights in a tent, suffering from the extreme cold as he tried to rent a small house to lodge in. Another time at Qom, Contarini and his party became ill in the caravanserai with a fever, accompanied by delirium, which made them say many insane things and imperiled their safety. Contarini also complained repeatedly about the food he had to eat on the Silk Roads: salted sheep tail in Astrakhan, a desperate omelette made from duck eggs, and a little butter at Derbent on the Caspian Sea, rancid horse meat in several places, an unsavoury supper featuring bread, turnips, and a little meat at Kutaisi, and stinking mare's milk in a Tatar camp. Western visitors to Tatari frequently represented the Mongols, often called Tatars especially in the western part, as voracious gluttons. Contarini hated the enforced boozing as he encountered, where people guzzled strange alcoholic brews and imposed them on their guests. Hospitality, the reception and care of strangers, can often seem to shade into hostility, the stranger received as an enemy. Towards the end of his journey, when he reached Derbent, Contarini was ragged. His lambskin-lined jacket was all torn, and above it he wore a very sorry pelisse, and on his head a lambskin cap. People who saw him wondered that he could even afford to buy meat. His companions told him he looked like he had just come from a debtor's prison. Both Contarini's and Barbara's accounts made clear that enslaved people and slavery were ubiquitous features of the Silk routes from Venice to China. In many languages, for example, English, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, Swedish, the medieval and modern word slave derives from Slav. Where and when this originated remains debated, but it reinforces the historical context in which the medieval European slave trade drew most of its human source from Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, especially Circassians. Brocquier, travelling in the Middle East, was troubled by the slavery he saw, including at Damascus the sale of a young black girl, not more than 15 or 16 years old, led through the streets nearly naked. At the Black Sea port of Poti, known to Venetians and Genoese as Faso, Contarini stayed on 3 separate occasions in the house of a Circassian woman named Marta, enslaved by a Genoese man. While Marta gave him a warm welcome, his bed, he complained, consisted of a borrowed, miserable counterpane, and he grew ill. Marta tended him with an oil and herb poultice. Barbara was given 8 enslaved Russians at Tana by the local emperor's brother-in-law, for which he made a reciprocal gift of some of his merchandise. The fate of these Russians is unclear. Later at Venice, while he was buying wine at the Rialto, Barbara saw 2 Tatar men in chains who had been enslaved by Catalans. On trying to escape, they had been taken by the Venetian vintner. Barbara complained to the notorious Signore di Notte, who freed the men. Barbara took them in for 2 months, and it transpired that they knew people in common from their shared time in Tana. One of the freedmen even claimed that Barbara had inadvertently saved his life during a fire there. The men reminisced about their travels and the sudden reversals of fortune and extremes of captivity and liberty that characterized their voyages. Barbara eventually sent them home on a boat to Tana. At this time, slavery was endemic in this region, supporting and supported by trade with the West. Barbara described how a Franciscan named Thermo of Tana used money he'd made by catching birds to buy a Circassian boy, named in Pretrice, and made him into a friar. At Poti, Contarini was warned by a certain Bernardino, an Italian, not to go back to Tana because he himself would be enslaved. At Tabriz, Contarini met 2 enslaved Slavs who had become Muslim and who formed a close friendship with Contarini's servants and gave Contarini himself insider information about the Shah's movements. Boy slaves, eunuchs, royal slaves, sex slaves, human gifts between rulers and enslaved prisoners of war all feature in Silk Road narratives of this time. Barbara estimates that in a Tatar encampment there were 1,500 slaves, herdsmen, couriers, and the like. Travel is often supported by servitude, and to travel is not necessarily to be free. The journey across the Silk Roads involved vast distances over inhospitable terrain. Wadis growing with tamarisk, broom, and oleander gave way to stark plains punctuated by hoofprints, then mountains, then deserts. But along the Silk Roads were distinguished towns and cities, of which one of the most captivating was Tabriz, also called Tauris, in modern-day Iran. Situated on the edge of the Aladagla Mountains, where colourful oxide slopes meet snowy peaks, it was a rapidly growing Georgian and Azeri city in the Middle Ages. It became the capital of the Mongol Ilkhanate dynasty in 1299, and later the capital of what Western visitors called Persia. The Jalayirid, Karakoyunlu, and Akkoyunlu empires of the 14th and 15th centuries. Tabriz was hugely wealthy, wondrous in its architecture, its gardens, and the merchandise in its bazaars. Marco Polo's father and uncle had been partners in trade partly based in Tabriz, as they sought to expand the reach of their mercantile ventures. Marco himself visited the city in the 1270s on his way to China and spent 9 months there on his return journey. He found it surrounded by beautiful and luscious orchards and frequented by Genoese who visited to buy the goods that arrived from foreign lands, from India and Baghdad, Mosul and Hormuz. Mandeville, in the 1350s, described Tabriz as the most well-known of the many lovely cities in the vicinity of Armenia. Tabriz was rebuilt by Mahmud Ghazan, died 1304, the ruler of the Mongol Ilkhanate that covered what is now Iran, Iraq, and most of Syria. Tabriz was furnished with elegant baths, markets, and a caravanserai at the city's entrance and exit gates, as well as an adjoining customs house. The city was therefore reconfigured around hospitality for visiting merchants and to maximize the efficiency with which money was drawn from them for that hospitality. The Spanish diplomat Ruy González de Clavijo was part of the embassy of Henry III of Castile to the Mongol conqueror Timur, Tamerlane, 1336 to 1405. Clavijo spent nearly 3 months at Timur's court in Samarkand in 1404 and left a long description of his journeys via Tabriz. On entering Tabriz, he was told a story about a group of Genoese merchants. They had bought one of the hills overlooking the city in order to build a castle and trading post there. But once they started building their fortress, the then Sultan, Jalayir, reneged and told them that they were welcome to buy and remove as much merchandise as they wanted, but merchants were not allowed to build or buy their own castles. The Genoese merchants came to appeal to the Sultan, who ordered that they all be beheaded. Clavijo seems to have kept a diary as he travelled, and he gave detailed descriptions of many cities in Persia. He found the great city of Tabriz delightful and enchanting. Its water supply via irrigation channels and conduits was of particular interest to him. He noted the public drinking fountains and troughs, which even in the summer were cooled with pieces of ice. Historically, the region did indeed have magnificent ice houses with upper and lower chambers. Ice was gathered in the winter, packed in straw, and held underground for the summer months. The caravanserais were built along fine roadways with open spaces well laid out. Inside, they had separate apartments and shops with offices. In the markets, wonderful silks were sold in the immense concourse of merchants and merchandise. He described the women coming to the shops to buy perfumes and unguents. They wore a white sheet with their face covered by black masks, so their identity was completely unknown. Clavijo noted this as an interesting custom, but passed no comment on it otherwise and did not associate it with Islam. Rather, he was overawed by the lavish mosques, beautifully adorned with tiles in blue and gold. At the same time, he observed that many of the beautiful civic buildings were in a dilapidated state, pulled down at the command of Miran Shah, 1366 to 1408, the Timurid emperor who had conquered Tabriz and would, in 1408, after Clavijo's visit, lose the city and have his head impaled in front of Tabriz's walls. After 9 days in Tabriz, Clavijo had a favourable impression of the city and left with a group of horses given by Timur himself. He was told about the reliable system of relays and post houses set up by Timur, each a day or half a day apart, each of them containing dozens of horses to serve the high road all the way to Samarkand. The infrastructure of trade and diplomacy conquered space between geographical, political, and religious barriers. A few decades later, in 1474, Jehoshaphat Barbaro stayed at the caravanserai in Tabriz during his visit to King Asim Bey, again Shah Usun Hassan. On the way there, Barbaro had been attacked twice, first by some Kurds who had killed 4 of his companions and stolen their sumpter mules, specially bred pack animals. Barbaro had fled on his horse. Shortly afterwards, a man appeared on the road between Khoi and Tabriz and demanded to see Barbaro's letters of introduction. When he refused, this man struck him with a blow on the face that caused Barbaro pain for some 4 months afterwards. But at the royal court in Tabriz, Barbaro was greeted courteously by the monarch who, through an interpreter, promised to redress his losses entirely. One approached the king's lodge, the sultan's reception chamber, through a gated garden, a mud-walled meadow full of pretty contrivances, including a fountain always brimming with water. The king sat on a cushion made of cloth of gold, his scimitar beside him, and the entire lodge was bedecked with carpets. It was decorated too with finely wrought mosaics of different colours. The king was surrounded by his counsellors and singers and musicians, playing harps, lutes, rebecks, cymbals, and bagpipes, making an agreeable sound. He presented Barbara with some luxurious garments, a furred gown, a jacket, a silk girdle, and a bombazine headpiece. Barbara was then instructed to go to the Tabriz Maidan, the main marketplace, to watch the weekly games where wild wolves were brought in to fight with men. Later in his stay in Tabriz, he saw various exotic big cats, elephants, a giraffe, and civets. The court seems to have been full of the very wonders of the East. Rubies, sandalwood, elegant porcelain and jasperware, pearls, cunning cameos, tents embroidered with gold thread, sugar loaves, and delicious confectionery. Barbara's time in Tabriz, defined by its refinement, pleasure and entertainment, recalls the false paradises that were greedily read about in European travel writing. Contarini's stay in Tabriz just a short time later could not have been more different, and shows how travellers often experience the same place in radically varied ways. He found it a dangerous, expensive city. At the caravanserai, he was greeted with abusive whispers and called a dog. People said he had come to create a schism among the Muslims. The host told Contarini to keep himself concealed and hide away in the caravanserai. When his party grew hungry and needed provisions, Contarini, his interpreter or travelling companion named Agostino of Pavia, had to sneak out to get them. Contarini glimpsed many bazaars full of silks and merchandise of almost every kind. However, he was recognized and abused and told that he should be cut to pieces. Eventually, he left the Tabriz caravanserai as it became engulfed in a local conflict and sought refuge at the Armenian church in the city, where he obtained lodgings for his groups and their horses. The pursuit of the earthly paradise was at the back of most travellers' minds, even though many accounts of paradise held that it was inaccessible to mankind. Travel writing and fantasy go hand in hand, as travel is always about being somewhere else. A might-have-been world around the next corner or through the next mountain pass. Mandeville, who frequently described places that he hadn't visited, and moreover that didn't exist, wrote laconically, "I can't really describe paradise properly because I haven't been there, and that grieves me." When writers did describe paradise, it was sometimes a lush garden, the Edenic and Islamic traditions, sometimes an island, as in the Voyage of St. Brendan. Perhaps a high mountain peak, as we saw in the description of Ethiopia, with a spring from which the great rivers ran. It was said that on a journey to paradise, one was likely to meet temptation, lying in wait in some coppice or hedgerow, and one would have to hope for hope and perseverance to appear on the way, to give the strength and courage to reach the ultimate destination. Some thought paradise was located towards the bottom of the world, beyond Ethiopia and towards the Antarctic, whereas others held that it was in the east, beyond Cathay. Yet from biblical writers to Christopher Columbus, it is hard to find agreement where the earthly paradise was to be found. For instance, on the Beatus maps that circulated widely in 12th and 13th century Europe, paradise is an enclosure near Mount Lebanon at the top, east of the map and on the edge of Asia. On the Borgia world map, made in southern Germany or Bohemia about 1430, paradise is a pretty garden in the far northeast, top left corner, past China. On Giovanni Leardo's Venetian map of 1442, the Paradiso Terrestro is towards the top of the map, east of India, and depicted as a magnificent city, a city not unlike Venice itself in aspect. Just as vividly evoked as the earthly paradise was its opposite number, the false paradise that could seduce the careless traveller. The ancient Greek geographer Strabo, 63 BCE to 23 CE, had located a lost or false paradise in India. He wrote that Alexander the Great had been told of this obscure pleasure land, which was a thing firmly of the past. It had a permanent harvest, springs bubbling with water, milk, honey, wine, and olive oil. Because of abundance and luxury, the people had become lazy and impious, and so the god Zeus had swept all the pleasures away, turned it to dust, and made the people toil ever after. It is often a solace to travellers that those places that provide transitory delights are also bound to poverty and conflict. A false paradise might be somewhere to be visited, but one wouldn't want to live there. From the 13th century, the land of Cockaigne, Cockaigne, was the false paradise most widely represented. Cockaigne was on the distant shore somewhere. Work was forbidden, free sex with willing partners was available to all, and sinuous brooks ran with youth-giving liquors. The sun never set, and one's clothes were even free from lice. Pigs voluntarily roasted themselves as tasty pies flew through the air. The shingles on Cockaine's pretty church were made of wheaten cakes, and one could tug away the sweet masonry and eat and eat and eat. It was a dreamland of plenty. Cockaigne was a place only in poetry, a product of the Western imagination, and stories of it often circulated among monastic audiences. The land of Cockaigne was a fantasy for those who could not travel, for people confined to a cloister. Cockaigne mocked the simple, austere world in which a medieval monk had to live, a world in which one was expected to avoid the deadly sins of gluttony and luxury at all times. The fantasy of Cockaigne turned this upside down, with the idea that somewhere abroad there was a place where all appetites could be indulged and even sated, the ultimate but sinful resort. The Silk Roads abounded with similar false paradises. The most famous of these was the pleasure garden built by Hassan ibn Sabah, died 1124, who in the myths written about him was called the Old Man of the Mountain and led his sect of assassins. Historically, the assassins were an Islamic sect, a branch of the Ismaili, but were represented fancifully in subsequent centuries as isolated heretics whose members undertook suicide missions on behalf of their demigod leader. Marco Polo, as he travelled through Persia to India, was one of the first Europeans to report on the Old Man of the Mountain, saying that he had been told the story by many people. Polo added the historically realistic detail that the Sheikh of the Mountain was overthrown in the year 1262 by a Khan of the southwestern part of the Mongol Empire, Hulegu, died 1265, who besieged the false paradise for a full 3 years. This place was usually believed to be somewhere in Syria or Persia, and is now identified with the Nizari Ismaili fortress of Alamut in northern Iran, destroyed in 1256 by Mongol forces. The sect was responsible for the deaths of caliphs, crusaders, emirs, and atabegs, and for at least 2 attempts of the life of Saladin, but was also a sophisticated centre of learning and spiritualism. The Old Man and his alpine false paradise took on their own imagined grisly features which were widely reported by travellers and came to supplant the historic reality of Alamut. Description of the Old Man's Garden reveal ideas of the paradisiacal plenty and luxury. The world as a fool's paradise. The German historian of the Crusades, Arnold of Lubeck, died 1212, located the Old Man in the territory of Damascus, Antioch, and Aleppo. Here, Arnold wrote, the Old Man, a prince, had built many beautiful palaces enclosed with the highest walls. Many sons of his peasants were brought up from the cradle in these palaces, and they are taught various languages, namely Latin, Greek, Romance, Arabic, and many others, instructed by the prince's teachers until they reached adulthood. Then they were fully convinced that they must obey every word and command of the prince of the land, and in return, they were promised a place in paradise. In Arnold's telling, the false paradise was a kind of secret military training camp come university in the mountains, a place where young minds were bent to the Old Man's purposes. In the Old Man's Garden, young men were given narcotics, usually hashish, hence the sect's name, assassins, the hashish eaters. This narcotic would make them fall into a kind of dazed stupor of utter pliancy. At this point, the Old Man would secure the young men's loyalty, promising each man that if he should agree to die, he would enter this paradise eternally, and have the young virgins forever, and as much sex with them as possible, and they would still remain virgins. And so each young man who came to visit would make a promise to be loyal to the Old Man, and they became unafraid of death, because the beautiful paradise awaited them. Through this trick, the Old Man would send the young men into his rivals' territories. The loyal servile youths, dulled with the Old Man's magic potions and now unafraid of death and looking forward to a posthumous life of endless sex in paradise, would kill the old man's rivals, plunder their riches, often sacrificing themselves in the process. Mandeville, writing circa 1356, delineated a sumptuous, well-fortified castle on a mountain which included the prettiest garden. This contained the sweetest herbs and the loveliest flowers, alongside fine fountains and also many pleasant halls and chambers decorated with gold and azure. Mandeville also included the detail that the old man had contrived various entertainments and beasts and birds that sang and moved by virtue of clockwork machinery, as if they were alive, suggesting both technical ingenuity and the perils of false seeming. In Mandeville's description of the garden, there were 3 virgin girls not yet aged 15 and 3 rosy-cheeked lads of the same age. They all wore golden clothes and were introduced to visitors as angels. They sat around 3 pleasant fountains connected to an underground conduit, so that whenever the old man wished, one fountain ran with wine, another with milk, another with honey, and he called this place Paradise. The story of the old man of the mountain and his false paradise shows a distrust of civilization, violence lurking behind the garden's seductive artifice. The story recognizes travelers' desire for both the earthly paradise and its false equivalents. Medieval travelers identified current or former paradises in the lush orchards, sumptuous bowers and arresting brothels they encountered on their route. The Flemish pilgrim, Jus van Gestelle, travelling through Egypt in 1481, glimpsed rich merchants indulging themselves in summer houses and pleasure pavilions near Cairo. These fortunate men enjoyed banquets and orgiastic parties with beautiful women. Van Gestelle commented that it was like the earthly and heavenly paradise rolled into one. As a mere passing traveller, he could gaze wonderingly in, relieved to be excluded from its deceitful charms. The old man of the mountain did not prosper. At some point, all the other local lords learned about his ruse. They marched together on his castle with their armies of archers and elephants, and they killed him and destroyed his false paradise. Later travellers were unsure about exactly where the old man's castle had been, but making their way along the Silk Roads, they often passed remnants and ruins, alluring rubble that spoke of lost consequence and faded power. This caused some to wonder if they had stumbled across the last vestiges of the false paradise of the old man of the mountain. During his travels along the Silk Road, Josaphat Barbaro learned from a certain Dominican friar named Vincent, a native of Kaffa, about violent routs in the year 1486 of the local peoples by fervent Muslims. One such place that had been attacked was the country of Gog and Magog, somewhere near the Caspian Mountains. This was a nation, Vincent told him, of Christians who followed the Greek rite and had been violently slain. Barbaro seems to have accepted that there was a land called Gog and Magog, a place and a people repeatedly mentioned by travellers, but also without fixed coordinates, or even a fixed religion. In the Bible, there is a cryptic mention of Gog and Magog, at once a person or people, a tribe, and a place. In the Apocalypse, it is written that, after 1,000 years of tranquility, Satan will be released to seduce the nations over the 4 quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, gathering them all together in battle, Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 to 9. Then Gog and Magog will spread over the breadth of the earth, encompass the camp of the saints and the beloved city, Jerusalem. And a fire will come down from heaven and devour them. Here, Gog and Magog were understood to represent Satan's forces in a last-ditch attempt to overcome Christendom, and were a cornerstone of millennial thinking, of the epic battle to come after 1,000 years. By the Middle Ages, Gog and Magog had undergone many transformations, as a place, usually a mountain range, or as a people. Gog and Magog were thought to be located somewhere on the Silk Roads, either in the Caucasus Mountains or beyond China. Gog and Magog were sometimes said to be at Derbent on the Caspian Sea. Derbent's name comes from the Persian Darband, barred gate. Alexander the Great was said to have trapped the tribes of Gog and Magog here behind closed gates or walls, restraining them from imposing their designs on the rest of the world. The Spanish Franciscan of circa 1350, who claimed to have been in Ethiopia, also said he had resided in the castle of Magog, a wonderful fortress built of magnetic iron above the river Magog. It had a counterpart castle of Gog across the valley, and 10,000 men could reside in each. Between the two was a set of iron gates, shutting the entrance to Tartary. In a complicated and elaborate set of transformations, these enclosed tribes moved eastwards in the Western imagination, seeming to reflect developing fears of incursions by the tribal groups across Asia. Alexander's Caspian Gates even became the Great Wall of China in some 14th century accounts. Ibn Battuta, an indefatigable traveller from Tangier in northwestern Morocco, wrote that the Great Wall of Gog and Magog was 60 days from China. This territory, he said, is occupied by wandering tribes of heathen who eat such people as they can catch, and for this reason no one enters their country or attempts to travel there. He said he had heard about this only from people who had never been there. The people of Gog and Magog were represented equally variously, either as a group of Hebrew-speaking Jewish cannibals said to be locked within these mountains, waiting for the Antichrist to release them and lead them into Christendom as in the biblical account, or as Tatars. Sometimes they were said to be giants, or to practice incest or free love, or to poison wells in an effort to spread the plague. A closely related tradition developed, especially in Germany, of a group called the Red Jews, who inhabited a land in the east and would one day invade Europe during the apocalypse, seeking to overwhelm Christendom. Mandeville's 14th century travel guide presented a revealing depiction of Gog and Magog. According to him, the Jewish people of 10 lost biblical tribes lived there, constrained by walls, mountains, and the Caspian Sea. They chose not to escape via the Caspian because they didn't know where it would lead them. In Mandeville's account, they spoke a secret language known to no other men, and for these reasons, the Jews have no proper land of their own except this enclosed space between the mountains. And even for this, they had to pay tribute to the Queen of Armenia. Mandeville's description of Gog and Magog foregrounds a crucial issue for the traveller. Is land or nation a matter of language? Is having a proper land of one's own what makes a people a people? Medieval definitions of nation tended to conjoin language, customs, and religion. Gog and Magog can be seen as attempting to think through what it means to be a diaspora, to be a people without a proper land, in a world in which cultural identity was derived from land and language. The changing representation of Gog and Magog displays many features of medieval travel cultures. Places were often extrapolated from vague biblical or historical references. Such places were highly mobile, serving the visitor's needs rather than the specifics of geography. Gog and Magog stood for a dimly apprehended but clearly moralized place. It was a moral landscape waiting for the world to claim it. Fantasies of Gog and Magog were suffused with fantasies of coming to the end of time and to the ends of the world. Gog and Magog also represent the thoroughgoing anti-Semitism of many medieval Christian travellers who, even when curious and receptive to new cultures and marvels overseas, reserved a vicious hatred for Jewish people wherever they were encountered. It was as if travel across the Silk Roads depended on conjuring warlike adversaries whose minds were set on the conquest of Europe. Throughout the Western history of travel writing, as throughout medieval literature, Jewish residents and visitors tend to function as primal outsiders, represented as inimical to Christian culture and fundamentally threatening. In this form of knowledge, the actual power dynamics of Christian Europe, in which the Jewish communities formed a tiny and embattled minority, were reversed, with a fantasy that saw the Christians as persecuted explorers and gave a threatening agency to imaginary Jewish aggressors, deep within the secretive bounds of the Silk Roads. The creatures of India. Here follow some of the kinds of monstrous creatures of India. Snakes so huge that their diet consists mainly of stags. An animal called the leucocrota, with the body of an ass, a stag's haunches, the chest and legs of a lion, horse's hooves, a forked horn, and a face that is nearly human. Tawny bulls whose hair stands on end in a hideous fashion. They have an immense head and grin open-mouthed from ear to ear. They can extend their horns for battle, and any missile bounces off their tough hides. They cannot be tamed. The beast called the manticore is found in India too. It has a human face, 3 rows of teeth, a lion's body with a scorpion's tail, and burning eyes. It's a blood-red colour and hisses like a snake. It feeds on human flesh and can run faster than a flying bird. The unicorn is also found there, with the body of a horse, a stag's head, elephant's feet, and a pig's tail. In the middle of its forehead is a single horn, 4 foot long, gleaming bright and incredibly sharp. The unicorn is very fierce and has an awful bellow. It transfixes anything in its way with its horn. It can be killed, but cannot be tamed. There are crabs, too, with pincers 6 cubits long. They can seize elephants and drown them underwater. The Indian Ocean produces tortoises, from whose shells people make roomy houses for themselves. 11. From Persia through India. Hormuz, Calicut, Cochin, Maldives, land of the Brahmins. We now follow the route southeastwards, trailing the vicious hot winds to the great port of Hormuz on the Persian Gulf. This was a popular route from the vastness of the Arabian desert to the rich wonders of India. If one didn't travel to India and China via land, one could take the quicker and arguably safer route by sea. From around 1400, the sea passage became more established than the land route, with the voyage eastward starting at the Strait of Hormuz, where the Persian Gulf opens into the Arabian Sea. The ports on the Persian side of the strait, especially Hormuz itself, were the main havens for trade and exchange between India, Arabia, and the Indian Ocean. Because of ongoing incursions from Mongol armies, the entire town of Hormuz had been relocated around 1300 from the mainland to the tiny island of Darun, a harsh peak made of brilliant red ochre sands and salt. Later medieval New Hormuz was a markedly multicultural city with merchants and navigators from China, Gujarat, and Armenia mingling with Venetian and Genoese brokers, attorneys, and missionaries. Around 50,000 people lived densely packed within about 5 square miles. Hormuz had magnificent bazaars and hundreds of vessels docked in its harbours, Italian galleys bobbing alongside dhows made out of coconut husks held together by thread and wooden pegs. Marco Polo, visiting Hormuz after travelling through Persia in the 1270s, noted all sorts of spices, precious stones and pearls, silk and gold fabrics, elephants' tusks, and many other products being sold there. But he was disturbed by the torrid, scorching hot climate and by the local custom of plunging neck-deep into water to escape from the heat of the summer desert winds. Polo called Hormuz an insalubrious place. Other visitors likewise felt that Hormuz was best avoided. Its sweltering weather seemed to reflect a broader corruption. Odoric of Pordenone was one of the most important travel writers of the European Middle Ages. He was an intrepid and loquacious Franciscan missionary, described by contemporaries as small in stature with a red forked beard. He travelled with another friar, James of Ireland, about whom very little is known. Oderic's world spanned the Friulian village of Pordenone, where he grew up, 75 kilometres northeast of Venice, and a 3-year stay at the court of the Great Khan in China. His account of his travels became very widely read and much imitated. He visited Hormuz in 1318 and said that the heat there was incredible and dangerous, and that there were neither trees nor fresh water. He described how the heat caused men's testicles to hang down their legs as far as their knees. In the 1350s, John Mandeville elaborated on Oderic's account, saying that the heat made men's bollocks hang down to their shins. This was due to their considerable physical degeneracy. Local people knew how to bind the testicles, smearing them with a special ointment to hold them up. Otherwise, these men would die. Some manuscripts of Mandeville's travel guide include pictures of the men of Hormuz, their vast testicles flopping down their legs like extra shapeless limbs. Such testicular rumours may simply reflect that age-old license, via travel, to titter at the absurdities and unreliability of the human body. But the idea that the heat of Hormuz caused men's testicles to sag to their shins came from the encounter of travellers with different versions of nature, including climate. While earlier geographers had believed the equatorial torrid zone to be uninhabitable, by Oderic's and Mandeville's time it was understood that, even though people lived there, the tropics existed in a kind of freakish juxtaposition to the temperate lands and balanced civilizations of Europe. Nature did strange things to the inhabitants, and the outrageous heat of Hormuz was reflected in the dissolute bodies of its menfolk. Oderic called Hormuz the gateway to India. The city was also then the gateway to the strange, the marvellous, and the frightening. The stuff in its bazaar would make its way to the markets and households of Western Europe. Yet at Hormuz, the European traveller had left the Holy Land far behind and had left Christendom too. Customs, weather, food, even human bodies had become unfamiliar and astonishing. From Hormuz, vessels made their way across the Arabian Sea and to the Indian Ocean, following the main east-west sea route. This route connected Europe and the Middle East to the great territory of India, named after the Indus River running down from the mountains on the subcontinent's northwest side. The medieval terminology of India embraced the entire subcontinent, from what is today eastern Iran to Myanmar and beyond. India was conventionally divided into three parts. According to Mandeville's definition, these were Lesser India, a temperate region, Greater India, a scorching hot region, and Northern India, a mountainous, icy region. The Venetian traveller Niccolò Conti described the first part of India as being from Persia to the Indus River, today's Afghanistan and Pakistan. The second part from the Indus to the Ganges, that is, the northern section of India, today's Gujarat, Rajasthan, Punjab, Uttar Pradesh and Nepal. And the third part, all that is beyond, the south of the Indian subcontinent including Sri Lanka and what are now Bangladesh and Myanmar. For Conti, this third part was the most sumptuous, wealthy, elegant. The people here, he said, led a more refined life, removed from all barbarity and coarseness. The men were extremely humane, and the merchants very rich. Each traveller to India had their own idea of how the subcontinent's theoretical geography mapped onto the places they were visiting. India itself was often described as comprising thousands, perhaps 5,000, islands or territories, a landscape of almost infinite variety and diversity. Despite the familiarity of Indian goods in European markets, India, as an idea, was reported as a place of abundance and strangeness, marvels, idols, and natural prodigies, with much to teach the attentive traveller. European travellers had read about the enormous wealth and nibbana-inducing pleasure gardens they were likely to find there. And some travellers' experiences of India seemed to echo or confirm this. They found strange fruit and pungent spices almost freely available, amazing palaces wrought from exotic materials, and non-Christian princes who mulcted dazzling riches and absolute power from huge populations. In India, nature shocked at every turn. The air was thick with heat. It felt like one was breathing broth. Plump mosquitoes hung lazily in the air, worrying at the neck and wrists and ankles. Reticulated snakes, thrice as long as a man, crawled through city streets as elephants went forth, caparisoned with castles atop their backs. Wily, grinning monkeys and spotted wildcats attacked those travellers foolish enough to take to the roads after dark. In the night sky, the map of the stars was all different, as if the great painted cloth of the firmament had been twisted about. Odoric of Pordenone, visiting India in 1318, said in summary, "In the whole world, there be no such marvels as in the realm of India." The Franciscan missionary Jordan of Severac, travelling through India in 1329, repeatedly found that he could not describe what he saw there. The perfectly horrible heat was more intolerable to stranger than it is possible to say. The mango, which he called aniba, a version of its Marathi name, was a fruit so sweet and delicious as it is impossible to utter in words. The trees of India were so many and so diverse that to describe them would be beyond the comprehension of man. If travel writing is a form of knowledge, a way of mastering place, then India consistently eluded such mastery. It was impossible to describe. Indian spices, gems, scent, linen, even parrots and cats were exported westwards to the Middle East and thence to Europe, staples for wealthy consumers across the world. The medieval documents archived in the Cairo Geniza, a synagogue storeroom, show an incredibly wide range of objects being traded westwards out of India. Waterskins full of pickled fish, coconuts and coconut scrapers, carpets, rat traps, fishermen's gear, glassware. Not surprisingly, the parts of India best known to travellers from the west were the merchant ports on India's western coast, Kambat in the north, Thane, now a suburb of Mumbai, Calicut, Kozhikode, Cochin and Kollam in the far south. The Venetian merchant Niccolò Conti left two accounts of his travels in India. The first he gave to the Spanish traveller Pero Tafur when they met in Sinai in 1437. and the second he recounted later to the Italian humanist Poggio Bracciolini, 1380 to 1459, when they met in Rome. Conti spent many years in the Middle East and India, involved in the gold and spice trades. After travelling as far as Java, he stayed for months on the Malabar coast of southwestern India, probably in 1419 to 20. His account of it, as given by Bracciolini, combines utterly prosaic descriptions of each town's circumference with flights of fancy. Conti's first observation about Malabar was the wealth of ginger, pepper, Brazil wood, and cinnamon. These were all rich pickings for the European market. But he immediately also pointed out the enormous snakes, 6 ells in length, nearly 7 meters. Harmless unless irritated and attracted to little children. While this seems to be a description of a python, the other animals he says he saw there are harder to identify. Airborne cats, perhaps colugos or flying lemurs, that flew from tree to tree by extending their feet and shaking their wings. A harmless 4-footed serpent with an oblong tail whose meat was prized as the best kind of food. A 7-headed winged serpent that could kill a man with its breath alone, living in the trees. Be aware, in this region there are hippopotami living both on land and in the water. They are half man, half horse, and they love to eat nothing more than men when they can get some. Conti was particularly impressed by the important port city of Calicut. Calicut was a familiar place for Western travellers, mentioned by Pliny and Ptolemy, even in ancient times as a source of pepper. Conti found it to be a noble emporium for all India, selling paper, ginger, cinnamon, lac, shellac resin, cherry plums, and the precious zodori, white turmeric root used for stomach medicine in the medieval West. Calicut was India's main western port in the 12th to 14th centuries, and gave the West the unbleached cotton fabric calico. It was at Calicut in 1498 that the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama landed, when a multitude of people, all dark and naked, flocked to the beach only covered with cloths halfway down the thigh, with which they concealed their nakedness. Da Gama's biographer, Gaspar Correa, 1492 to 1563, claimed that, for the locals, the Portuguese was something they had never before seen. This tone of wonder and the self-aggrandizing pose of being the first arrivals is hard to square with the medieval history of the Malabar coast, whose ports had a long history of welcoming strangers. By 1400, the area was deeply cosmopolitan. It is inconceivable that the locals had not seen foreign merchants before, as the city had for many years been central to the spice and silk routes. From the 1340s, Cochin started to rival Calicut as the key western port. Cochin, a promontory on an island, was transformed by a flood in 1341, which both destroyed the nearby ancient port of Kodungallur, Karanganore, and created a deep natural harbour beside the promontory. Cochin always had a diverse population, including many Buddhists, Hindus and Muslims, as well as Christians, following the Eastern Syriac Rite, Nestorians, and Jewish worshippers who founded a synagogue in Cochin in 1344. In 1405, the Perempada Swarupam princely family moved their capital to Cochin, and the city flourished. The Portuguese landed there in 1500 and occupied it in 1503. In 1524, Vasco da Gama would be buried there, in the Church of St. Francis, often called the first Christian church founded by Europeans in India. The goods traded out of Cochin and from the Malabar coast were highly prized in the West and made the area dazzlingly wealthy. The plenty there seduced Western visitors, although they were more troubled by local customs and religions. Landing at Cochin around 1400, the visitor would have been greeted by huge stone statues, round-bellied and garlanded, of Krishna and Shiva, alongside secular reliefs of naked dancers. The ornate multi-story buildings were guarded by legions of carved animals, and even the local coins had tiny animals stamped on them. The local statuary had a level of delicacy and intricacy, and was carved in precious materials that were largely unknown in Europe. The temples were worked in local dark woods, alive with carved leaping tigers. The gables were crowned with a lordly sitting elephant, the peaceful and wise god Ganesha, symbolizing wisdom, comprehension, and the removal of obstacles. Other statues called to mind the saints of Europe, carved with their symbolic attributes, but in India they were often boldly naked, nipples and phalli proudly displayed, and with animal parts. On first glance, figures of the mother goddess Varahi standing upright holding a baby to her breast looked similar to the Virgin Mary. But Varahi had a sow's head, sometimes tusked, and an aspect of vengeance rather than meekness. Conti strongly warned Pero Tafur when they met at Sinai against going to India. According to Tafur, whose account of Conti differs somewhat from Bracciolini's, Conti had spent some 40 years in India and knew it very well. In fact, he had married an Indian woman, a match made by a local prince, and had 3 children, all born in India. Conti warned against the long and troublesome route between India and Europe. He himself had been forced to convert to Islam in Mecca. In India, the visitor would have to contend with strange races without laws or rulers, the unusual air, the different food and drink, the bestial people he claimed to have seen cannibalism, who, he said, were unable to govern themselves. Conti seemed to be saying that India was no destination for the curious tourist. Tafur himself longed to go to India only out of curiosity. According to Tafur, Conti told him, "You will see heaps of gold and pearls and precious stones, but what shall they profit you since the people are beasts who wear them?" After listening to Conti's stories of India, Tafur gave up his plans to visit. He wrote resignedly, "I concluded that if I did not fly there, it was impossible to make the journey." Afanasy Nikitin was a well-connected merchant from the city of Tver, west of Moscow. In the late 1460s, Nikitin left his hometown to travel to the area around the Caucasus and western Persia with a merchant caravan, seeking new markets with the permission of Mikhail, died 1505, the young Grand Prince of Tver. Nikitin set off with a mixed group of Russian and Persian merchants, traveling through the established trade route of the lower Volga River. But as with many travelers at the time, circumstances intervened. After stowing away on a moonlit passage to Astrakhan, Nikitin was chased and shot at. His boat ran aground on fish traps, his luggage was plundered, he was shipwrecked in a storm and robbed again. And so, unable to pay for his passage home, and led by unhappy providence and a need to recover multiple losses, he went far from his intended route and left his fellow travellers. He visited Baku, where he marvelled at the naphtha fuel burning in the ground with inextinguishable fire. He travelled through Persia for a couple of years. At Jarum, he wondered at the cattle fed on dates. He reached Hormuz in the spring, probably of 1469. He celebrated Easter there. Familiar with the cool forests and snowy winters of western Russia, Nikitin found the heat of Hormuz astonishing. There, he said, the sun is scorching and burns men. But he also noted that the city was a vast emporium of all the world. You find there people and goods of every description, and whatever thing is produced on earth, you find it in Hormuz. Hormuz was a kind of crossroads of the oceans. Nikitin, alone and unsure but resourceful and entrepreneurial, found himself in bazaars teeming seductively with merchandise. From Hormuz, Nikitin embarked on an epic and surprising journey which went far beyond the mercantile remit of his initial project, and was recorded by him in a disorderly narrative comprising various notes and reminiscences. He sailed across the Arabian Sea, thousands of kilometers to India. Reaching India later in the year, he settled there for 3 years, working as a horse dealer. He spent time in Junnar, an ancient town a day's journey from the coast, sited on a stony crag surrounded by forests infested with wildcats. He observed how the Khan of Junnar had elephants and horses to ride, but chose sometimes to ride his male attendants, men who had been captured or bought from the Central Asian tribes of Khorasan. At this time, Junnar was part of the Bahmani Sultanate, a powerful Muslim kingdom covering much of the west and central region of the Indian subcontinent. At first, Indian people followed Nikitin about everywhere he went, transfixed by the whiteness of his skin and the clothing covering his whole body. Conversely, Nikitin described the dark-skinned people of India, both shocked and aroused by their nakedness, the women's bare breasts, and the wicked harlotry of the Bahmani women. He described the kind of Indian inn, sometimes called a dharmasala, sarai or satra, for foreign merchants. Hospices and shelters with food and a bed were often free to travellers as they supported trade. Nikitin says the landlady prepared food, made up the bed, and then had sex with the guest. He added that the local women seemed to like white men. They would have sex with their husbands during the day, and in the evening go to the foreign men, bringing sweet-spiced pastries for the foreigner and sometimes even offering the man money to have sex with them, because they like strangers and white people. At a pilgrimage and trade fair sited dedicated to the Hindu goddess Parvati, Nikitin noted the cheap price of the women and gave his reader a tariff: 2 jittal silver coins for intercourse with a woman, 4 varaha gold coins for intercourse with a pretty woman, 5 varaha for intercourse with what Nikitin seemed to regard as the most attractive woman, a comely, dark-skinned lady, all black with small and pretty nipples. To travel is to ponder sex and sexual discovery. We now call this sex tourism, but a great deal of sightseeing contains an element of lust. Sex tourism supplies travellers' wants and puts the traveller into an intimate set of financial, erotic, and exotic relationships with the people among whom they travel. Paying for sex, making money from sex, and having kinds of sex not available at home have long been part of the culture of travel. The romance of travel is often simply a synonym for having a new kind of sex or feeling sexually alive in new places. There is a strong sense that Nikitin broadened his own sexual horizons during his journey, rather than just reporting on customs he observed. As his travels went on, he became less censorious of the locals, less upright in his Christian values, and less sure of his Western Russian ways. He who travels through many countries will fall into many sins and deprive himself of the Christian faith, he reflected, self-accusingly about his time, probably in 1472, at the Muslim court at Bidar, the elegant capital of the Bahmani Sultanate. We might see Nikitin as an early example of the independent traveller who goes native, or for whom travel took on elements of assimilation and self-transformation. At first, he tried to avoid eating the local food, surviving on bread and water, but later ate hungrily with local Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims. He wondered at the country's spicery, its pepper, ginger, cloves, cinnamon, aromatic roots, all cheap and tasty and readily available. He got to know the customs and theology of other religions well. Having been robbed of his prayer books early on in his journey, he started to forget when the Christian festivals were. He didn't know when it was Easter or Christmas, and he began to lose track of what day of the week it was. He spent most of his time with Muslims, and at one point a local Muslim, Melik, forcibly converted him to Islam. Nikitin seems to have concealed his Christianity and started to wear Islamic clothing. He took on a Muslim name, Koza Isuf Khorasani, and declared himself to be between the two faiths of Christianity and Islam. His account finishes with a prayer in his Arabic to all-hearing, all-seeing Allah, in a clear and apparently voluntary profession of the Islamic faith. There comes a turning point. It may be hours or it may be months in each journey when we start to abandon the idea of going home, or at least of going home unchanged. Is there not a moment when every traveller asks themselves, what was the point? What has one got from one's journey? Could one just stay travelling and never go home? In each new place he visited, in each new foreign experience, Nikitin found new versions of himself that he had not known. The foreignness of the peoples and places he encountered was transmuted into the foreignness of his own past. Travel is often longed for as an escape from the banality and laboriousness of everyday life, but Nikitin went further than this. For if we say travelling for too long, we often feel the need to understand, even to become, the people among whom we travel. As we pick up new languages abroad, we sometimes also seem to take on new personalities, different selves. Nikitin was an unusually intrepid traveller, and he knew that his journeys were beyond unusual. He sent his account, his Russian, punctuated with Arabic and Turkish, back to Russia as a written testimony of what he had become in India. It did not circulate widely, but was copied into several chronicles as the record of a remarkable experience. In 1472, Nikitin started to make his way back to Tver and wrote some further parts of his narrative at Kaffa on the Black Sea. But he met his death, we are not sure how, near Smolensk in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. He had travelled so far, survived and engaged with such a variety of experiences, and undergone such changes, yet he became another traveller who never returned home. Somewhat similar to Nikitin, but more timid, was the Genoese merchant Geronimo de Santo Stefano, who went on a disastrous journey to India in the 1490s. Santo Stefano set off with his business partner, Geronimo Adorno, on what they thought was going to be a straightforward, profitable journey to buy coral beads and other goods in Cairo and sell them in India, and then bring back goods from India and sell them in Europe. The pair reached India sailing in a flimsy jalba, a low little craft made of old planks stitched together with cords and driven with cotton sails. It took the two Genoese 25 days to get from El Qusair on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea to India's Malabar coast. All went well at first for the two Geronimos. They found Christians living in the area around Calicut. They learned about the wondrous pepper trees and ginger roots and coconuts. They saw the devotions of the locals worshipping an ox. Cattle are holy in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism. Or the sun. Both Buddhism and Hinduism have significant solar deities. Or little homemade idols. They learned excitedly about the local nuptial customs, that each lady could take 7 or 8 husbands, and that no man wished to marry a virgin. They then sailed to Sri Lanka, their eyes agog as they came upon highly marketable merchandise. Cinnamon trees grew big as laurels. Precious stones, garnet, jacinth, cat's eye twinkled everywhere. Moving on to the Coromandel coast, on the southeastern side of India, they saw beautiful red sandalwood, perfect for building handsome houses. After 7 months somewhere on that coast, the two men then decided it was time to sell their merchandise. So they set off for a place they had heard about, a land called Ava, which covered northern and central parts of today's Myanmar, where there were wonderful rubies to be purchased. But a local war meant they couldn't take the route to Ava, so instead they travelled to Bargo in the Buddhist kingdom they called Lower India, now the southern coast of Myanmar. Things started to go badly wrong here for the two Genoese. They agreed with the Lord of Bargo that they would receive 2,000 ducats for their goods. Everything was finalised and contracted and understood, but the Lord of Bargo would not release the money. Geronimo went daily to his court to request payment. Each day they grew poorer and hungrier, and suffered more from the extremes of heat and cold. And then, after 55 days, Geronimo Adorno died. He'd never been a hardy man, and this finished him off. He passed away on 27th of December 1496, and there was not even a priest present to administer the sacraments. Geronimo de Santo Stefano had his friend's body buried in the grounds of a ruined church, an abandoned place frequented by none. He mourned his friend continually and prayed for his soul. He thought he might die too, but he rallied when at last he got paid by the Lord of Bargo for his goods. Then he set sail again. The Indian Ocean connected a vast trading network encompassing the east and west coasts of India, Mauritius, the Seychelles, the Maldives, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and Sumatra. They were connected by trading ginger, sandalwood, pepper and cardamom, coral, paper, arsenic, civet, perfume, and indigo. On medieval European maps, the landmass of Asia disintegrates into a myriad of tiny islands across the Indian Ocean. Monsoon winds linked the entire area over distances of thousands of kilometres. Geronimo de Santo Stefano might have turned back and headed for home when the Lord of Bargo had given him the money he was owed, but he decided to sail southeast for Sumatra, attracted by its silks, resins, and spicery. Many travellers are painfully aware of that moment when a purposeful, well-organised and much-anticipated trip takes on the heart-stinking character of a fool's errand. Every expense incurred, every misfortune encountered, every experience at best, a disappointment. And yet the traveller ploughs on, hoping to get something good from the voluntary ordeal. Disasters continued to afflict Geronimo as he travelled onwards. His property was seized. The local lord claimed it as Adorno's estate as he had died in his jurisdiction, and much of it confiscated. He sailed first to Kambat in Gujarat, and there he sold everything he had for silks and resins that he could trade back home. Thus, Geronimo de Santo Stefano sailed south to the palm-fringed shores of the Maldives due south of Cochin. The Maldives, coral atolls comprising several thousand tiny islands spread over a vast area of cobalt sea, were at this time an Islamic sultanate and a busy entrepot amid the Indian Ocean trading routes. The archipelago was far from remote, due to its location on the main sea routes from Java and Sumatra to India, Aden and Hormuz. The islands exported ambergris, tortoiseshell and coir rope, but were also a trading post for spices and gems and Chinese silks and pottery. The bad weather forced Geronimo to spend 6 months among what he described as the black and naked, but healthy and courteous locals, living on fish and a little imported rice. The Maldivans had followed Buddhism until their conversion to Islam in 1153. Local people held that their conversion was thanks to a visiting sage from the Maghreb who had banished a demon. The islands remained dotted with remnants of their Buddhist past in the form of Hawitha mounds and stupa temples, the sites of which were often converted into mosques. Flying fish made their way purposely over the waves. Crabs of many sizes scudded everywhere on land. At dusk, giant black fruit bats, winged flying foxes, like foxes in flight, circled the breadfruit trees. Ibn Battuta visited the Maldives for a period of about 8 months, landing at the port of Kinhalas in late 1343. Having travelled enormous distances across Eurasia, he can to some extent be seen as an early explorer. It is not clear what made him visit the islands, although he seemed to go on a touristic whim, saying simply that he had heard about them. The islands, led from the capital at Male, were then under the sovereignty of Queen Khadija, died 1380, a sultan's daughter who assassinated her brother, and later at least 2 husbands. Ibn Battuta was welcomed as a sage from North Africa and appointed chief judge, and he also married a woman from the Maldivian royal family. He found the people pious and upright and sincere, but their devotion lax. He noted the unveiled women's costumes, naked from the waist up. Once he had established himself as a senior judge, he tried and failed to make women, including the Queen, cover themselves. He drove people to mosque with his constable's staff on Fridays. He recorded that his main diet was a coconut flesh, coconut milk, coconut honey, and coconut sap, oil. Having married 4 women, fathered a child, and made some enemies in the upper echelons of Maldivian society, Ibn Battuta left in August 1344 for Sri Lanka. The tiny atolls of the Maldives had a long reach because cowrie shells harvested there and in southern India were the main currency across the Indian Ocean. The tiny shells were also used for jewelry and in religious rituals. Visiting southern China in the 1280s, Marco Polo observed white cowries being used as currency. 80 cowries equals 2 Venetian groats, alongside gold coinage. Ibn Battuta noted how the Maldivans gathered like bead-like shells from the sea, left them in pits for the flesh to disappear, so they were then ready to be used as currency, at an astonishing rate of 400,000 cowrie shells for 1 gold dinar. He related that the Maldivans bought rice with the shells from the people of Bengal and that Yemenites used the shells for ship ballast. He also recalled that he had seen the shells being used in Mali and elsewhere in West Africa. Later, similar money cowries were encountered by Portuguese travellers in Senegal in the 1440s. Geronimo de Santo Stefano spent 6 months in the Maldives. Eventually, the conditions looked reasonable for setting sail again, but after just 8 days, his little vessel was overwhelmed with water. It was impossible to bail it out, and it sank. Some of the men on board drowned. Geronimo floated overnight, clinging onto a wooden plank, praying desperately for divine mercy, lost in the middle of the traveller's loneliness. What a strange turn of events. A timorous and materialistic Genoese merchant adrift alone in the Laccadive Sea for an entire night. The water streaked with the silver of moonlight, and full of unthinkable creatures, stingrays flying soundlessly in the deep, massive shoals of fish clouding the waves. Eventually a vessel came and rescued Geronimo. He was returned to Khambhat in Gujarat. Geronimo de Santo Stefano made his long way back to the west as part of a Silk Road caravan via Hormuz and Isfahan. This caravan of Armenian and Persian merchants was attacked and plundered. But finally, Santo Stefano reached the Ottoman port of Tripoli, now in northern Lebanon, on the Mediterranean coast. Here, the Genoese had formed friendly relations with the Ottoman Turks, and there was an established community of Genoese merchants. Geronimo wrote to his friend, Messer Giovan Jacopo Minor, back in Genoa, describing his disastrous travels. He evidently made little or no financial profit on his travels, so he thanked God for the spiritual profit he had made, the great mercy shown to him. He signed off his letter written in September 1499, intending to return home. In the accounts of travellers like Nikitin and the two Geronimos, the whole of India appears as a barely comprehensible fever dream, strange, alarming, a land of promised delights and unknowable perils. If the world was an encyclopedia for the traveller to peruse, India was its own strange book, hard to read and understand. For Nikitin and Santo Stefano, travelling in India confirmed rather than denied its ever-surprising nature as an immeasurable geographical and social system. India was both an almost indescribable place of wondrous stories and a false paradise where a life of easy luxury could turn to a diseased demise with astonishing speed. If one were to travel further in India, at least according to Mandeville, one would find a land where the people had feathers on their entire body except their faces and the palms of their hands. These people could move across water just as easily as across dry land. Nearby, there was another country where one would find two oracular trees, the tree of the sun and the tree of the moon. The trees spoke Indian and Greek and foretold visitors' futures. It was hard to travel there, however, because of wild animals, dragons and snakes in the desert. In the nearby Isle of Python, tiny people lived off the scent of wild apples. They had to carry these apples with them whenever they travelled abroad and died if they were deprived of the scent. There were dozens and dozens of other Indian lands and islands, one where the people had no heads but rather eyes in their shoulders and mouths on their chests. One where an eyeless and headless group of people had mouths in their backs. Another where there were flat-faced people without a nose or eyes or lips. Another where there were people with one huge lip, which they could use as a sunshade. Another land where there were people who were both male and female at the same time, with the genitals of both. John Mandeville even described a kingdom where the king was appointed not because of his wealth or nobility, but through something called an election, according to whoever is morally superior and most righteous and just. What a different world India was. In Europe, kings usually inherited their thrones or gained them through might and strife. These peripheral, unencountered people at the threshold of civilization represent the fantastical creativity of the imagination, and the traveller's love of categorization and miscategorization. Yet by constantly depicting India as an exotic wonderland, Western visitors often overlooked the everyday humanity of its inhabitants. The motifs of awed discovery and exoticism are touristic ways of not seeing similarity, of not really thinking that the people one meets are fully human, and indeed, the polytheism of Hinduism remains scandalous to most Western visitors. There were two striking points of social difference that almost all Western visitors to India noted. Sati, the ancient Hindu practice of a widow self-immolating on her husband's funeral pyre, and the sect of the Brahmins. About Malabar, Odoric of Pordenone said that if a dead man left a widow, they burn her alive with him, saying that she should abide with her husband in the other world. He repeated the observation in Champa, Cambodia or Vietnam, saying that after his death a married man was burned, and his wife is burnt alive along with him. This, Odoric was told, was so she could keep him company in another world. Odoric noted Sati as a curiosity, but also provided the cultural rationale for it, the social and theological reasons behind a religious ritual outside Christianity. The missionary Jordan of Severac likewise described how noblemen's wives followed their husbands into the fire, for the sake of worldly glory, and for the love of their husbands, and for eternal life. They burn along with them with as much joy as if they were going to be wedded. Far from being horrified, Jordan remarked that it was wonderful. He had even seen as many as 5 living women taking their places on the pyre of one dead man. Niccolo Conti, the Venetian merchant who visited India in the 1430s, described Sati as a royal custom. The king of Vijayanagar, Hampi, had, according to Conti, 12,000 wives, of whom between 2,000 and 3,000 had been married on the condition that they would be immolated with their husband on his death. This they considered was a great honour which placed them above their other thousands of wives. He also said that in Cumberland there was a sect of monogamous vegetarian priests whose wives, by law, were burned with the body of their husband. For Mandeville, sati was practiced in a particular Indian territory where social order was topsy-turvy. The women there were sad when their children were born and happy when their children died, when they throw them in a large fire and burn them. The reason for this, they said, was that their children were being born in this world of labour and grief and burdens. This renunciation of life presaged the practice of sati. It was a sign of truly loving one's dead husband to throw oneself into the pyre. Mandeville said that the widows did this to be cleansed of all filth and vice, so they will be clean in the next world. Geronimo de Santo Stefano and Geronimo Odorno observed, to their horrified astonishment, several cases of sati during their 7-month stay on the Coromandel coast. They regularly saw or heard tell of local women who burned themselves alive on their husbands' funeral pyres. Unlike later travellers to India, medieval visitors did not try to stop sati when they witnessed it. But, like later visitors, they had a voyeuristic fascination with the burning widows which acknowledged the different ways of believing and behaving, or, to put it another way, a kind of cultural diversity. Sati wasn't as strange as European visitors made out. After all, they were used to the burning of heretics and criminals, and frequently worshipped images and relics of saints who had voluntarily suffered the most gruesome deaths by fire. St. Lawrence had been roasted on a gridiron, the flames of a slow fire licking at his body as he joked with his tormentors, "Turn me over," as if he were a grilling flank of mutton. Sati was another of those odd parallels witnessed by the traveller, shocking because, out of context, violence to which one had become inured became awful in its clarity. Sati would, in time, become a mainstay of the colonial perspective on India, a custom that evoked spectacular horror and strange devotion. Upon the Portuguese conquest of Goa in 1510, one of the earliest acts of the first Duke of Goa, Afonso de Albuquerque, 1453 to 1515, was to ban sati. In medieval Europe, Alexander the Great, died 323 BCE, was an exemplary king, soldier, scholar, and explorer. He conquered and ruled an empire from Macedonia to India. He was also an exemplar of the transience of worldly power, having died of a fever or, in some accounts, been poisoned at the age of 32 after building his global empire. The English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, died 1400, wrote that the story of worthy, gentle Alexander was so well known that every person had heard something of it. Manuscripts of Alexander's life often included technicoloured images of his adventures, such as his descent in a glass submarine during his siege of the city of Tyre, or his flight over Babylon, Baghdad, in an aerial box harnessed by griffins, or the moving death of his loyal horse, Bucephalus, during a battle in the Punjab. Histories and romances of Alexander's empire became staples of Western fantasies about the East, many of them not even tenuously connected to historical fact or geographical reality. Mandeville told a story about the Brahmins' reaction to an imminent invasion by Alexander. In India, when Alexander came to invade the Brahmins' territory, the gentle people wrote a letter to him. They asked, "What would be sufficient power for a man for whom the world is not enough? You'll find nothing here for which it is worth waging war against us, because we've got no wealth, and all the goods and chattels in our land are owned communally." They explained that they had always enjoyed peace until this point, and this was the only thing that Alexander would be able to deprive them of. The warrior Alexander read this letter and thought to himself that it would be terrible to disturb the Brahmins, and so he replied that they should continue to observe their good customs and not fear him, for he would not invade or molest them. Mandeville's story is representative of how the Brahmins in India offered curious visitors an arresting lesson in natural law and played a key role in European primitivist ideas of the noble savage. Descended from the Hindu priesthood, the Brahmins were the most elevated social class in central and southern India. Their ideals included voluntary poverty, austerity, and intellectual endeavour, not unlike a Christian monastic order. By the 14th century, Brahmins were no longer only a priestly group, but worked in many professions and held key appointments at the courts of the subcontinent's Islamic sultanates. Western travel writers like Mandeville described them as good, honest men who follow a fine faith and lifestyle. They were not, he noted, Christian, but by natural law, they are full of excellent qualities. Thus, they complied with the Ten Commandments and placed no value in material wealth. In other words, they were like perfect monks, but without formal religion. They are not jealous, proud, or covetous, and they are not lecherous or gluttonous. And they only do unto men as they would have done unto them. Mandeville strikingly citing Jesus' golden rule in support of a non-Christian group. Brahmins were not accurately represented in such writing, but were rather idealized. They were virtuous pagans, exemplary in their natural perfection. Mandeville placed them in an Indian island called the Land of Faith, a bucolic, egalitarian, and crimeless society. There was even an absence of storms, thunder, war, hunger, any kind of tribulation. A long 12th century poem about Alexander's deeds in the East, Thomas of Kent's Roman de toute chevalerie, described the Brahmins as vegans, people of a strange doctrine, who ate only fruit and herbs and roots, that which the earth destined for them. No meat, fish, bread, or flour. In Thomas's accounts, the Brahmins were at the edge of the world. He approvingly described how their devotion to God led them to self-immolate in order to sooner get to paradise and divine glory, a kind of positive counterpart to the duped assassins whose pursuit of paradise was based on an illusion. The Brahmins, conversely, were reported in the West as being sincere, the representatives of natural goodness. After travelling in India in the mid-14th century, the Italian Franciscan friar, Giovanni de Marignoli, told a story about the conversion and baptism of a Brahmin. This happened when Giovanni was staying in the important seaport of Colum on the Malabar coast. Here a man of majestic stature and snowy white beard, naked from the loins upwards, approached Giovanni. He was a Brahmin of great austerity and sincerity. He prostrated himself in front of him and went to kiss his naked feet. Giovanni demurred. The Brahmin then sat down on the ground and, via an interpreter, gave an account of his life. Strikingly, the interpreter was the Brahmin's own baptized son, who had some time before been abducted by pirates and sold to a Genoese merchant. The Brahmin man had come from the most remote edge of India. He described his vegetarian life, his habit of fasting for 4 months a year, his diet of boiled rice, fruit and herbs, and his devotion as a priest. He had only had the one child. In Giovanni's telling, God had recognized the old man and enlightened him with wisdom from within. God had then performed a miracle by speaking through the priest's idol. The idol told him, against its own will, "You are now on the path of salvation." It then instructed him to travel 2 years by sea to Colum, where he would find the messenger of God. And so, to Giovanni's mind, it had come to pass, and after 3 months of instruction, he duly baptized the old man, giving him the name Michael, after the archangel, who was particularly associated with mariners, with the weighing of souls on Judgment Day, and with the pre-Christian greatness of humankind. Michael returned to his home to convert the people there. In Giovanni's moralization, the story serves to exemplify that God is no respecter of persons. Rather, whosoever keeps the law is accepted and is taught the way of salvation. The story moves seamlessly from praise for the Brahmin's nobility and piety to his conversion, a kind of individual missionizing from a position of admiration that also results in the obliteration of the Brahmin's idolatry. The story is at once believable as an encounter and foreshadows very many subsequent colonial conversions, and also highly generic: the wise old man, the repudiated idol, the sea voyage through which he is transformed. The Brahmins and similar virtuous pagans offered travellers the possibility that nature in the world beyond Christendom was not hostile. In European travel writing, much was made of the potential of India, or India, to hold within it a kind of natural perfection. India was a sort of laboratory of the imagination, alluring, luxurious, often receptive, and of an almost infinite diversity. Giovanni's story of the converted Brahmins suggested that, in the world beyond Europe, there was a receptive audience waiting for the travelling missionaries of Latin Christianity. Tips for business travellers from Tana to Khan Balak, circa 1340. 1. You must let your beard grow long and not shave. 2. At Tana, you should furnish yourself with a dragoman. Do not try to save money by taking a bad dragoman instead of a good one. 3. You will do well to take at least 2 good male servants who are acquainted with the Tatar tongue. 4. If a merchant wishes to take a woman with him from Tana, he can do so. If he does not like to take one, there is no obligation. Only if he does take one, he will be kept much more comfortably than if he does not take one. However, if he should take one, it will be better that she be acquainted with the Cuman tongue as well as the men. 5. To travel from Tana to Astrakhan, take with you 25 days' provisions, i.e. flour and salt fish. You will find enough meat at all places along the route. 6. The route from Tana to Cathay is perfectly safe, whether by day or by night, according to merchants who have used it. Only if the merchant, ingoing or coming, should die upon the road, everything belonging to him will be sequestered by the lord of the country in which he dies, and the officers of the lord will take possession of all. And likewise if he should die in Cathay. But if his brother is with him, or an intimate friend and comrade calling himself his brother, then to such a one they will surrender the property of the deceased, and so it will be salvaged. 7. In these parts, they will call all the Christians from Romania westward Franks.